Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another tutorial working with JSON and C#. Before we talk about JSON and what it is, let's understand the scenario. Let's say we want to pass an object to another program. Now this could be over the internet or it could be over the wire, like using FTP as a file. So how would you do this? For this example, let's just keep it to a file. So what you would do is that you would use an option in C# called serialization. And what that allows you is to take the object and serialize it into bytes. And then you can take those bytes and save it either to the database or in memory, or take those bytes and save it into a file. Or you can take the bytes, convert it to a string, and then save it to a file, which in our case, we'll be using the file using JSON, so will be converted to a string. Now, to better understand this, let's actually take a look at the serialization and how this happens using JSON. So here we have a class called weather forecast, and it has some properties. And we have another class here called high volumes. We have another class here called high low temps, and we have the temperature high and low. And this is being referenced as part of a dictionary object and the temperature range. And so what we want to do is we want to put some data into these classes and then serialize this into a JSON byte or a string. So here we've have our little program. It's a console application. And so what we've done is create our class, the weather forecast, and we're setting all of its properties to some values. We're setting the date time, we're setting the temperature, with summary being hot, and dates available, which is a dictionary object, having date time of now, and then also having date of yesterday. So if we do a little bit of formatting on this, so it'll be easier to see. And then we have the temperature ranges, which is a dictionary object of a string and having an object. Now, this was selected because we wanted to show that you can have complex types inside of properties, and that it would actually save the values of this class into a byte array or into a string. So if we were to actually run this, and so now we can see that we have all of our values in here, and we have our list, which is index based, and then we have our summary of words, which is basically a array of string values, and then we have our dictionary, which is the key is cold, and it has a complex type of high and low. So then how would you do the serialization? So that part is pretty simple. Now that we have the class, what we want to do is you want to make sure that you are referencing the system.text.json, because we're going to serialize this into a JSON object. Now, we haven't explained what a JSON object is. We will. Let's just go through with just serializing this, and then we can figure out and talk about the JSON object. So the first thing to do is we're going to create a variable called byte or JSON bytes. And the next thing we want to do is create a JSON serializer. And then we want to serialize this to UTF-8 bytes. And then it's going to ask us, well, if we want to have any options. We're not going to use the options right now. We will later on. But what we want to do is just basically pass it the value of our class, which is the weather forecast. And so if we were to run this, we would actually have this into a byte. You're not going to be able to, of course, read this because it's a binary object. So as you can see, it's basically a byte array. What you could do then is, as you've seen us convert byte arrays before in previous videos, what you would do is create a string variable, and let's just call this JSON bytes string, and now we'll go ahead and do the system.text encoding, and we'll use you can do the UTF-8 get string and then pass it the JSON bytes, or we could just use the ASCII as well. So we'll just keep this simple. So now it'll convert it to a string. So let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see now, we have a string representation of what our class is supposed to look like. So the next thing we could do is, instead of doing all of this, the serialization has another method that we could use. Instead of going to bytes and converting it, we can convert it straight to a string. So let's just go string and create a variable JSON string, and this time it's going to be JSON Serializer, and just go serialize, and this will convert it to a string for us, so we don't have to do the byte conversion for that. And then these two strings should look exactly the same thing. So because we're using the debugger, we can actually convert this to the JSON visualizer, so you can see it a little bit easier. And if you bring it up here, this is our JSON object. Basically, it's going to be property date, and there's the value. There's our temperature. Our summary is hot. Dates available should be index based, which it is, 0 and 1, the two values. The temperature ranges, which is our dictionary, which is cold, and the complex object of high and low. And then this one should be just a string array, which we have it represented here. So if you open this into a string, it's not formatted. Everything is in basically in one line, and so it makes it a little bit harder to read. And we can now use a option to indent the. So if you look here, we have the JSON Serializer option. So we could just say new JSON Serializer option, right indented equals to true. So let's actually take a look and see why. So we have the serialization option, and then we have this backwards. So we should have, looks like the options should happen afterwards, which we could have done basically this way. So we could have just done it this way. Okay, so let's actually run this now. So if we take a look at this, as you can see now, it's indented, so it makes it a little bit easier to read. And we have our date, we have our temperature, we have summary, we have our the list of dates available, we have our the dictionary of code with the complex object, and then the string array of the summary words. And then we could take this and save it into a file. Generally, because you would want to save space, you wouldn't do the indentation unless you want it to be more readable, so you could pass it some options. So that's basically how you do serialization, and we've shown how we can serialize this into a JSON. And then what you could do after this is to deserialize it. So for example, now you have this this string object and you want to serialize it. So what you could do is basically have a second object here, and we'll call this JSON Serializer Deserialize. And then we'll take our JSON string, but we need to tell it, so we're going to use the generic. So the generic is going to be our weather forecast. So basically we're telling it to go ahead and use the string, the JSON string, and then cast it into, deserialize it, and then cast it into the weather forecast. So let's go ahead and run this. And if you take a look, we were able to deserialize that object, the string, into this object. So what is JSON? JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a way to take an object and store it into a text, and then you can transfer this and exchange data back and forth between applications that are dissimilar, meaning that, let's say I've written an application in .NET and I want to interact with a system that is not written in .NET. How would you pass messages? Well, you could you could serialize this string, this JSON object, and pass this to the maybe application, a web application that has JavaScript, and then they can read this string and then parse it and go through its properties and read the property and then read its value and display it on a web page or their different application. So then how does the JSON object really work? So if we open up our Visual Code, and you can also go here and make sure that you set your document into JSON so that things can get formatted. Now in .NET, what we did was we basically took our weather object and converted it. So when you're converting an object, you can't really name it. In JSON, basically what you do is to denote an object, you can open it and close it with brackets, and that's basically reads your object. And then if you wanted to describe a property, so then we could have a string called date, and if you wanted to put a value to it, we separate it with a colon. Now it can have a value of a integer value or a string. So in this case, if it was a string, you could just then do give it a date format, something like this. And then if you wanted to have another property, you would separate it out with a comma, and then you would have the second property. Let's call this an integer value, and you can set the value of, let's say, 10. So this would then be an object that has two properties, date and which is a string, and then a integer value. So if you then wanted to convert this into a .NET object, you would have to have a class that had these two properties. The property names are case sensitive, But in the options, as you notice, you could pass a option, an additional option that is not the indented, but you can use another one that says that the properties could be case insensitive. Otherwise, you have to have these properties matching exactly with the case sensitivity to have it deserialized back into your class. Then how do you then display an array? So if the brackets are objects, then the arrays, we can just call this array data, and then the arrays would be displayed this way. So these are the squiggly brackets, and these are the straight brackets. And then for the array, then you can have some values, some other values, and this is how you can show the array of other values. So if we go back to our Visual Studio, notice that we have our weather object, and then we have our property, right? And then this one, date available, is an array. So the array starts with a bracket. Then we have the index 0, which is has the value, and then the index 1 has the additional value. And then if you had complex objects, so basically what you can do is then denote that back with another squiggly line or squiggly bracket, and then have the property that's called cold, which is this is the key of the dictionary. And then inside of that, you can have another object that then has the key and then the value. So if you really look at this, you have it's basically written out as key pair value. You have a key, which is the property, and then you have the value. It could be a string, or it could be an int, it could be an array, or it could be an additional object, and then it goes back to the property, and then there's another object, and then there's a property, and then it has the value for it. And then if you're displaying these properties, then you would separate them out with these commas. So hopefully this will give you a very quick crash course into the JSON object and how to actually read the JSON object as a string value. So this is a pretty quick review of the JSON object and the it's a string format. So what happens when you have a string object but you don't have a class for it? So here we can deserialize into an object and everything would work just fine. But what happens when you don't have that deserialization? So what you could do in that case, here we have our string here, and how do you then read this? We can read this into a document object. Well, it usually is called a DOM. So we have an object here called the JSON document. And then we're going to use the JSON document.parse, and then we're going to pass it that JSON string into it. So what this will do is it will parse this and then convert it into this object JSON document. So let's go ahead and run this really quick. So as you can see, we were able to read this document, which means that this string was a valid the string was a valid JSON object. Then how do you read those properties? Well, if you come in here, we have this JSON document, and the root element is something called that has a property called value kind, and it's an object. So remember, we talked about the squiggly line denotes an object. So, and then after that, we have the properties. So what you could do is take this JSON document and then get the root element for that. So now that we have the root element, we can actually write a if condition that can check to see if this root element value kind is equal to an object. If it's an object, then what we can do next is to iterate through this document to get all its properties and then display all of its values. So let's actually write a for each loop. So for this one, let's just do JSON document root element, and let's actually enumerate through the object, and let's just call this JSON document element. And then what we can do is console write all of its values. So this would be name, or this would be name. And then if we wanted to have its value, let's separate this with a block, and then its value. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually also look at the value of this. So we could actually write another case statement or an if statement in this case. If the value is equal to its value kind is equal to a string or so let's just output all the strings, or if this was a if it was a number. And then if you had an array, then you could do the same thing, write an if condition that will check its value kinds. If it's an array, then you can decide to do something else. But if we do this, and let's go ahead and actually execute this really quick. So as you can see, we have our date, we have our temperature, we have a summary, and of course we ended with the hello world. And these are, this is a string, this was a integer value, and then this was a string, so we don't get the complex objects in here. Now, if you wanted to see everything, we could just take this if condition out. And what will happen is that we will still get the string of the arrays, but it'll be represented as a JSON notation. So if we go back to executing our program, if we come in here, notice that we have our date and our string value. We have our integer value. Now this one, the value is actually an array, and this is in the JSON notation. Same thing with this one. This one is a object notation, or the complex object that we had before. So if you wanted to write this and control every aspect of it, you could come in here and you could actually look at the value kind. And then have one for an object. I will have one for array, string, and numbers, and null values, and Boolean. So then you can decide how to iterate through that if you wanted to have much more of a control over this. So there's one more way to get the values, especially if you know your object type. So what you could do is come over here, get the root element, and then from here just say get property, and in here let's just take the date. And what this will do is it'll give us a JSON element, and from here, if the value kind of string and whatever, but we already know the property, so we know the value of it, so we just can say get the string, and then it'll give us the string type in here. So let's go ahead and actually execute execute this to see it in action. So instead of outputting this into the console, let's actually go here and output it in the immediate window. So now, as you can see, we got our string that we were looking for. So this is a quicker way of getting the property that you're looking for, so you don't have to worry about iterating through, especially if you know the properties that you are specifically looking for and you already know what type it is. So this is how you can get the actual values from it. So this was a quick review of the JSON, and there are other complex topics like writing your own custom serializers and deserializers, which we'll go over at a later time. It's just it's not a common function. So thank you for your support and stay safe. We'll see you on the next video tutorial.